In this video, I'll be assembling my 2x72 belt grinder from the plans that are available on my website. The first step in the assembly is to fasten parts C and D to parts B1 and B2. And to do that, I'm going to put some glue on the top of B1 and B2 for part D. Since my machine has already been assembled, I've already drilled all the pilot holes, but you would have to do that before you drove any screws when you're assembling yours. Now I can get some glue put on for part C and then dry those screws as well. Next, I need to get some glue spread on for part F, and I'm going to clamp that in place and make sure that it's lined up flush on the edge. Now that it's lined up and clamped on, I can drill the pilot holes and dry the screws. I can now spread some glue on part E and clamp that in place, and then drill the pilot holes and dry the screws. Next, I'll do the same for the other side, part G, clamp it flush at the edge, drill and dry the screws. I've cut a spacer to clamp onto the base, part A. Then I can get some glue on what is already assembled and clamp that down to the base, making sure it's tight up against that spacer. Then I can drill the pilot holes and dry the screws that fasten it to the base. Next up, glue parts I1 and I2 together and clamp those and set them aside to dry. To move this along, I'm driving in screws to clamp these parts. And then I can check the fit of the boom arm in the base assembly. It should be a snug fit, but still have some play to move back and forth smoothly. First, install the step pulley at the end of the drive shaft. Next, slide on the pulley side stop collar and tighten the set screw. If you're using one bearing on this side of the drive shaft, the collar should be 9 3/16 from the end of the shaft. If you're using two bearings, the collar should be 9 5/8 from the end of the shaft. Slip the pulley side bearing or bearings onto the shaft, then insert the shaft into the hole in the base assembly until the bearing seats in the recess. The drive wheel side bearings can be slid on next, and the plywood spacer after that. Then put the stop collar on and tighten the set screw. The drive wheel goes on next and is held in place with the locking screw. The end of the shaft should be flush with the outside face of the drive wheel. The hinges for the tracking and tension adjustment are fastened by driving screws through part M. A 5/8" nut is pressed into part R, and the boom locking rod is slipped through the holes in the base assembly. A 5/8" washer is added next, and then the rod can be threaded into that nut in part R. Part R is then held in place with screws, but no glue. Here I'm pounding a 3/8" T-nut into the underside of part L and using screws to make sure it doesn't come out again. Next, the 1/4" carriage bolt is put into the other hole and driven in flush. Then a nut and washer is threaded on to keep this bolt in place. Part L can be attached to the hinges with screws, and the nut and washer can be threaded onto the end of the boom locking rod. Thread the tension adjust carriage bolt onto the nut in part L and slide on a 3/8" washer and thread on the locking knob. Next, a 3/8" nut, then a washer, then the tension adjust knob, then another washer, and finally a 3/8" nut, and tighten that securely. Fasten these hinges with screws through the shim, part Q, and attach part H to the top of the base assembly with it tight up against part L. I use glue and a single 2.5" screw to hold it. Glue parts O1 and O2 to part M. And then glue and clamp parts P1 and P2 to O1 and O2. Then the tracking carriage can be attached to the hinges. Install the idler wheel onto the idler wheel shaft and drive in the locking screw. And then put a shaft collar up against the idler wheel and tighten the set screw. Slip a bearing on and put the shaft in the tracking carriage and seat the bearing in the recess. Slide the bearing onto the other end and seat that into the recess as well. Then put the locking collar on and tighten the set screw. Next, get a 1/4 inch fender washer onto the tracking bolt, thread on the tracking lock knob and another washer, then the wing nut. The parts for the tool rest are glued and screwed together next. Press a 5/8 inch nut into part T and glue it to part S. The 5/8 inch bolt can then be put through the boom arm and the tool rest slipped in underneath. The nut is then threaded on so that it will fit into the slot in part J. Screw the platen to parts X1 and X2. I'm not using glue as this will allow me to easily replace or adjust the platen as needed. The top and bottom rollers are temporarily installed in part U, and use these to line up the platen correctly and make sure it clears the rollers. X1 and X2 can then be glued and screwed to the platen frame. Next, get some glue on parts V and W and use the roller bolts to clamp those in place and line up the holes. Install the motor next. I recommend using one that is at least 1 horsepower and runs at around 1700 RPMs. The step pulleys I'm using are 3, 4, and 5 inch and will give the grinder belt speeds of 1100, 1800, and 3000 feet per minute with a 4-inch drive wheel. I recommend making a belt guard that fits around the pulleys in the belt, and this will have to be made to suit your motor and pulley arrangement. The final step is to add the platen attachment or the contact wheel as detailed in the plans and install a grinding belt. Line it up correctly and tension it, and then check the tracking by hand before starting the machine. It's also a good idea to do a final check to make sure everything is correct and all the fasteners are tight. Then it can be started and the wheels trued as shown in the website article and in the video. Well, as you can see, it turned out well and I'm pleased with it. The only thing I have left to do is build a stand to put it on more permanently and find a place here in my workshop because this will become a permanent fixture in here for sure. If you are interested in building one of your own, there's a detailed plan available on my website. The link is in the description. It covers every part, the dimensions, and what to make them from, and goes through every assembly step in detail from beginning to end.